Imagine a cold, muddy field in 1152. A 5-year-old boy stands shivering before a towering siege engine. His name is William, and he is a disposable pawn in a game of treason. His father, a minor lord, has broken a sacred oath to King Stephen, and now the king is out of patience. The king's men grab the boy, ready to strap him into a giant trebuchet, a catapult, to hurl his small body over the castle walls as a gruesome message to his father. But when the king's messengers demand a surrender to save the child's life, the father's response is chillingly cold. "I still have the hammers and the anvil to forge even better sons." The boy is left alone, staring at certain death. But against all odds, the disposable child wouldn't just survive that day. He would grow up to become the most formidable warrior of the Middle Ages. He would unhorse Richard the Lionheart, serve 5 different kings, negotiate the Magna Carta, and at the age of 70, lead a desperate cavalry charge to save England from a French invasion. Historians don't call him a legend for nothing. They call him the greatest knight that ever lived. This is the insane, true story of William Marshal. To understand how William Marshal became a legend, you first have to understand the brutal reality of the 12th century surplus sons. In the world of high-stakes feudalism, the eldest son got the lands, the titles, and the gold. The younger sons, they got a horse, a sword, and a firm handshake. William was the 4th son of a minor noble. In the eyes of the law, he was au zero. If he wanted to eat, he had to fight. His journey into the heart of medieval violence began in the household of his cousin, William de Tonquerville, in Normandy. This wasn't a school. It was a meat grinder. For years, William endured the grueling life of a squire, cleaning gore from chainmail, tending to massive war horses, and practicing until his muscles screamed. He was a late bloomer, a quiet, tall, and sturdy young man who didn't stand out until the first time he smelled blood on the wind. His graduation came in 1167 at the Battle of Neufchâtel. This wasn't a choreographed movie fight. It was a chaotic, claustrophobic brawl in the narrow streets of a burning town. William charged in with the reckless abandon of a man who had nothing to lose. He fought like a demon, but he made a classic rookie mistake. He was so focused on the combat that he didn't notice his horse was being hacked out from under him. By the end of the day, the French had been pushed back, and the Anglo-Norman lords gathered for a celebratory feast. This is where William received a harsh lesson in the economics of war. While other knights were bragging about the rich prisoners they had captured and the ransoms they would collect, William sat in a corner, bruised and empty-handed. He had fought bravely, but he had no horse and no captives. A veteran knight mocked him openly, saying, "Marshal, for your first gift, you've given the French a fine horse today." It was a humiliating moment. William realized that in the 12th century, chivalry was a business. Valor was great, but survival required equipment, and equipment required cold, hard cash. He vowed never to be the victim of the business of war again. From that day on, he transformed himself into a tactical machine. He realized that the knight who stays in the saddle is the one who gets paid. He began to treat every skirmish and every tournament not just as a test of honor, but as a high-stakes heist. He was no longer just a soldier. He was becoming a professional predator in a world of armored prey. After his humiliation at Neufchâtel, William Marshal didn't just get better at fighting. He mastered the tournament circuit, which in the 12th century was the equivalent of a violent, high-stakes professional sports league. Forget the romantic images of 2 knights poking each other with wooden sticks in a tidy arena. Tournaments in William's day were known as mallies. Imagine 2 small armies of hundreds of knights meeting in the open countryside with no boundaries and very few rules. The goal wasn't to kill. Killing was bad for business. The goal was to beat your opponent senseless, drag him off his horse, and hold him for ransom. This is where William became a rock star. He formed a legendary partnership with a Flemish knight named Roger de Gourgues. They operated like a tactical elite unit. While other knights charged in like hot-headed amateurs, William and Roger played it smart. They would wait on the sidelines, letting the others exhaust themselves in the dust and heat. Then they would strike. William's signature move was terrifyingly effective. He would gallop into the thick of the fray, ignore the sword swinging at his head, grab the bridle of an enemy's horse, and simply ride away with the man attached, dragging him back to his own lines to be processed for cash. The primary sources tell us that in his career, William captured over 500 knights. Think about that number. That's 500 sets of expensive chainmail, 500 war horses, and 500 heavy ransoms paid by the wealthiest families in Europe. He was becoming a self-made millionaire through sheer physical dominance, but it wasn't just about the money. It was about the crazy durability of the man. During a tournament at Joigny, William was so occupied with his work that a group of ladies asked him to dance during a break. He complied, still covered in blood and dust, singing a song he had composed himself. In another famous incident, he fought so hard in a tournament that his helmet was hammered into his skull by the force of repeated blows. When the victory ceremony began, William was nowhere to be found. They eventually found him in a blacksmith's shop, with his head resting on an anvil, while the blacksmith used a hammer and chisel to literally peel the mangled metal off his face. Through these displays of insane toughness and tactical brilliance, William caught the eye of the highest power in the land. King Henry II of England heard of this invincible warrior and realised he needed a man like that in his inner circle. William was no longer just a landless son. He was now the personal tutor and protector of the heir to the British throne, Henry the young king. He had officially moved from the muddy fields of the tournament to the dangerous corridors of royal power. Serving as the protector to Henry the young king was William's entry into the eye of the storm. The Plantagenet family was the most powerful and most dysfunctional dynasty in Europe. King Henry II and his sons were constantly at each other's throats in a literal cycle of civil wars. For William, this was a tightrope walk over a pit of vipers. He had to be a loyal knight, but to which king? The old lion or the hungry cub? William chose a path of absolute, rock-solid integrity that baffled his contemporaries. He stayed by the young king's side even when the prince was a rebel, a spendthrift, and a failure. When the young king eventually died of dysentery in 1183, William was the one who took the prince's cloak to Jerusalem to fulfill a vow the dying man couldn't keep. For 2 years, William disappeared into the Holy Land, fighting alongside the Knights Templar. He saw the rise of Saladin and the crumbling of the Crusader states. Experiences that forged him from a tournament champion into a seasoned strategist of global warfare. When he returned to England, he found a kingdom in chaos. Henry II was old, broken, and being hunted down by his other son, the legendary Richard the Lionheart. In 1189, during a frantic retreat, the aging King Henry was nearly captured by Richard. William Marshal stayed behind to hold the rear guard. In one of the most cinematic moments in medieval history, Richard the Lionheart, the most feared warrior in Christendom, charged at William. Richard shouted, "My God's legs, Marshal, do not kill me. That would be a wrong thing to do." William didn't flinch. He had a clear shot. He could have ended the Lionheart right there and changed the course of history. Instead, at the very last microsecond, William diverted his spear. He didn't thrust it into Richard. He drove it with shattering force into Richard's horse, killing the animal instantly and slamming the prince into the dirt. Standing over the future King of England, William growled, "No, I will not kill you. Let the devil kill you instead." It was the ultimate power move. He had technically defeated the greatest warrior king of the age without committing regicide. When Henry II died shortly after and Richard took the throne, everyone expected William's head to end up on a spike. But Richard the Lionheart wasn't a fool. He looked at the man who had just unhorsed him and realised, "I don't want this man as my enemy. I want him as my sword." Instead of an execution, Richard gave William a reward that would change his life forever. The hand of Isabel de Clare, the teenage heiress to massive estates in England, Wales, and Ireland. In a single stroke of a pen, William Marshal went from a wandering mercenary to one of the richest earls in the realm. The landless boy had finally won the game, but as he would soon find out, keeping power was much deadlier than winning it. Now, if you think William's rise from a disposable child to the man who levelled Richard the Lionheart is insane, hold on tight, because weren't fought on a farming field, but in the shadow of the most hated king in British history. We are about to dive into the era of the Magna Carta and a 70-year-old, William leading a suicide charge to save a kingdom. But before we get to the endgame, we need your support to keep these chronicles alive. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the greatest knight, hit that like button right now. It helps the algorithm recognize that real history is cooler than any fiction. Subscribe to Medieval Crazy History and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter of our ancestors' madness. And do me a favour, give us some hype in the comments. Who do you think was the more badass warrior, William Marshal or Richard the Lionheart? Let's see what you think. Now, back to the story and the arrival of a king that everyone loved to hate, John Lackland. With Richard the Lionheart's death in 1199, the English throne passed to his brother, John, better known to history as John Lackland, or simply the worst king to ever wear the crown. For William Marshal, this was the ultimate test of his crazy code of honour. King John was a man defined by paranoia, cruelty, and a supernatural ability to make everyone hate him. He was the kind of king who would starve prisoners to death and betray his own allies, just for the sport of it. The relationship between the greatest knight and the worst king was a psychological thriller. John was terrified of William. He knew that William was more popular, more respected, and a far better general. To break him, John used the most gut-wrenching tactic possible. He demanded William's eldest sons as hostages. Having been all disposable hostage himself as a child, William had to hand over his own flesh and blood to a king he knew was a psychopath. For years, William was pushed to the edge. John stripped him of his lands, humiliated him in court, and tried to bait him into treason. Any other lord would have raised his banners in rebellion, but William Marshal was built differently. He held on to a radical, almost obsessive idea. His oath was to the crown, not the man wearing it. Even when the rest of the English barons finally snapped and marched against the king, William stayed by John's side. This leads us to June 1215, on the marshy grass of Runnymede. On one side, a group of furious, armed rebels. On the other, a cornered and desperate King John. In the middle, acting as the bridge over a river of blood, was William Marshal. He was the primary mediator of the Magna Carta. He wasn't a rebel fighting for democracy. He was a pragmatist trying to prevent a total societal collapse. He convinced the king to sign the Great Charter, effectively putting the law above the crown for the first time in history. But the peace lasted less than a few weeks. The kingdom spiraled into the First Barons' War, and to make matters worse, the French saw an opportunity. Prince Louis of France invaded, landing on the coast of England with a massive army, intent on taking the throne for himself. Then, in the midst of this absolute catastrophe, King John did the one thing that actually helped the country. He died. John's death in 1216 left England in a nightmare scenario. Half the country was occupied by the French, the rebel barons were winning, and the rightful heir to the throne, Henry III, was a terrified 9-year-old boy. The kingdom was dead on its feet. The remaining loyalist nobles gathered in a dark room and looked at the only man left who had the grey hair, the scars, and the moral authority to lead them. William Marshal was now over 70 years old. He wanted to retire to his estates and prepare his soul for death. Instead, they handed him the keys to a crumbling nation and named him Guardian of the Realm. The old lion was being called for one last, impossible hunt. In 1217, the fate of England rested on the shoulders of a man who, by medieval standards, should have been long dead. William Marshal was over 70, an age when most of his contemporaries were either dust or bedridden. Yet, here he was, dressed in heavy mail, staring at the city of Lincoln, which had been seized by a combined force of rebel English barons and French invaders. The French, led by the Count of Perche, were arrogant. They had retreated behind the city walls, believing they could hold out forever. But they didn't account for the Marshal factor. William knew that a long siege would bleed the kingdom dry. He needed a decisive strike. He needed a miracle. In a display of tactical genius, William moved his forces with surprising speed. He found a secret way into the city through a side gate, but as his knights began to pour into the narrow, winding streets of Lincoln, the old man's blood began to boil. He wasn't just a general anymore. He was the champion of the tournament circuit again. The sources tell us an incredible detail. William was so desperate to get into the fight that he spurred his horse forward before his squire could fasten his helmet. He was charging toward the French spear lines with his white hair flying in the wind, completely exposed. His men had to practically grab his horse's reins and shout at him to stop so they could protect his head. Once the helmet was on, the old lion let out a roar. The Battle of Lincoln was a brutal, claustrophobic bloodbath. It was fought in the streets, in alleys and in the doorways of the city. William led the charge from the front, weaving through the chaos like the professional predator he had been for 50 years. The French were caught in a bottleneck, their superior numbers useless in the cramped city streets. In the heat of the clash, the French commander, the Count of Perche, was struck through the eye slit of his helmet and killed instantly. The French line shattered. The unbeatable invaders turned and fled toward the river, many of them drowning in their heavy armour, as they tried to escape. Against every single scrap of logic, the 70-year-old William Marshal had won. He had destroyed the French army, broken the rebellion, and secured the throne for the boy king Henry III. He didn't do it for land, and he didn't do it for a ransom. He did it because he had given his word. In that one afternoon at Lincoln, William Marshal didn't just win a battle, he saved the English language, the English crown, and the very concept of an independent England. The landless boy who had been threatened with a catapult had grown up to become the shield of a nation. After the triumph at Lincoln, William Marshal had one final duty: to die as well as he had lived. In early 1219, feeling his strength finally begin to fail, the old lion retreated to his manor at Caversham. He knew the end was coming, and in typical Marshal fashion, he orchestrated his departure with the precision of a military campaign. The scenes from his deathbed, recorded in his biography, provide a rare, intimate look at the heart of a medieval warrior. As he lay dying, his advisor suggested he sell his magnificent silk robes to give the money to the poor to buy his way into heaven. William refused. He insisted that his robes be distributed among his knights, the men who had bled for him. He told his grieving friends, a man's heart should be with his friends. It was a final act of loyalty to the Brotherhood of the Sword. In his final days, he fulfilled a secret vow he had carried for decades. He called for the Knights Templar and, in a solemn ceremony by his bedside, he was inducted into the order, wrapping himself in the white mantle with the red cross. He had lived as the world's greatest secular knight, but he would die as a monk of the temple. On May 14, 1219, William Marshal took his last breath. When his funeral procession reached London, the streets were packed with people who knew they were witnessing the end of an era. The Archbishop of Canterbury, standing over the coffin, spoke the words that would echo through history. "Behold all that remains of the best knight that ever lived. He was buried in the Temple Church in London, where his stone effigy still rests today, hands clasped in prayer, a sword by his side." William Marshal started life as a disposable child, a boy whose own father was willing to see him crushed by a catapult. He had no land, no gold, and no future. But through sheer physical grit, an unbreakable code of honour, and a legendary ability to stay alive in the deadliest century in history, he became the pillar that held up the British throne. He didn't just survive the Middle Ages, he mastered them. He proved that even in a world governed by kings and bloodlines, a man's true worth was forged in the heat of the anvil. One battle, one oath, and one charge at a time. The greatest knight that ever lived wasn't a myth. He was real. And his story remains the ultimate blueprint for what it means to be a hero in a world of madness.